Call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Chairman, I regret that the Minister wasn't able to beat me to take the call, but I'm sure that she's keen to do that and answer the questions that my colleague, the Honourable David Parker, has posed in his contribution. Just to briefly recap before I start talking about the technical issues involved in some of the parts of this, and Mr Chairman, can I express my disappointment at the motion that the Senior Whip from Labour moved, in that we are now debating these all in one debate. I would have much preferred to have had 34 separate debates on the specific provisions, and I'm also gobsmacked to see that the Senior Whip is so committed to the principles of Parliament operating at a smooth and appropriate pace that he's doing the work of the government whips who forgot to move that motion. But good on you, Mr Hopkins. You are from the opposition and here to help. But just to briefly recap on the point of a Statutes Amendment Bill, because there's some debate around it, and it would be again interesting to hear the Minister's contribution to this in regards to the mandate of the Statutes Amendment Bill. You'll notice that in the committee stage there are fewer provisions in this debate than were originally included in the bill that was referred to the Select Committee, and that's because the Select Committee determined that the number of changes to a specific act proposed in Statutes Amendment actually ruled some of those proposals out of order to be included in the Statutes Amendment. So it wasn't any one specifically of the measures proposed, but the number of measures proposed that ruled it outside. So that was the first point. The second one is that, of course, the Statutes Amendment proposals should be non-controversial. They shouldn't be altering specific policy unheralded previously, but they can correct an error in drafting. So if there's a drafting provision that's been made in previous legislation that's gone through, been debated by the House, and then an error put into legislation, then it's within the mandate of a Statutes Amendment Bill to have a correction, basically to rectify an error. So it may look like a policy contribution. Mr Chairman, the member who took the call immediately prior to me talked about how ironical it was to have this debate taking up the time of Parliament when these are technical issues, when they are non-controversial issues. He referred specifically to Part 12, which is amendments to the Land Transport Act of 1998. It talks about procedures for dealing with blood specimens. It talks about search warrants in relation to specific offences. It talks about the Search and Surveillance Act. It talks about traffic offences and infringement notices, mostly changing words without changing the meaning of the primary legislation or updating existing legislation. This Land Transport Act that the member was referring to in Part 12 is a piece of legislation that was originally passed by the House in 1998. So a lot of other acts have been introduced and passed since then that may have consequential amendments for the Land Transport Act. But the point that the Honourable David Parker was making was how ironical it was that we are debating this matter, which makes literally not a blind bit of difference to any member of the public and really doesn't require a lot of attention of the House, Mr Chairman. I'm just beating you to the button. Oh, you just so that we can't hear the conversation. That's very considerate of you. Thank you, Mr Chairman. So how ironical it was that we are debating this using the time of the House, but we have a significant announcement under this exact same legislation as is covered in Part 12, the Land Transport Act, a significant announcement in Northland to coincide with the by-election, which is now spelt B-U-Y, rather than any normal spelling of the word, because the National Party, by using the provisions of the Land Transport Act of 1998, spent $70 million on 10 bridges in Northland. It was an absolute coincidence that those bridges are being funded and announced, not through any normal process, but with the candidate and very fortuitously a big round black pig standing under a hoarding board for the National Party, Mr. Chairman.
Bring it back.
Mr. Chairman, so that's my contribution on Part 12 of the Statutes Amendment Bill number 4, which is the alterations to the Land Transport Act. Mr. Chairman, there's another specific part that I want to refer to, and I think it's Part 23. It is Part 23 on page 25. This is a much more substantial series of amendments than the one that I referred to under the Land Transport Act. So these provisions change the Official Information Act of 1982. You will see, members, will see from the alterations to the original bill that substantial debate was had on this at the Select Committee, and I want to ensure that as we go through the Committee of the House, that the Committee of the House has the same sort of opportunity to consider amendments. I've heard a few speeches from the National Party, particularly backbenchers, over the last 24 hours, and I'm feeling bold enough, having heard the contributions on the Members' Bill last night, to suggest with 100% confidence that not a single one of them has read any of the legislation that is being debated. They just stand up and read the research notes, and actually the opportunity for rigour in considering legislation is during this very stage. This is the time, Mr. Barclay, you should take the advice of the Honourable Maurice Williamson, who has paid more attention to detail in committee stages of debate than just about anyone I know. I think it was a maritime reform of some description, and the rigour that was applied to specific provisions of that legislation with the Honourable Maurice Williamson in the chair is the sort of rigour we should be applying to this. So this bill, in part, it was rigor mortis quite often, actually. In Part 23, this proposal is to replace Section 28(4) of the Act, and that deals with a very interesting topic, which is the ministers of the Crown answering requests made under the Official Information Act on time. It's actually a very important point of principle. It sounds like it could be almost veering into the policy area, but it's not. But the reason it's important is to draw to the attention of the committee is that we have had considerable abuse of this provision, this very provision that we're now changing. In fact, the Prime Minister recently commented in public that Official Information Act requests were either escalated and responded to very rapidly or were deliberately delayed because of political considerations. This alteration under Part 23 should strengthen Parliament's understanding that that sort of political abuse of the Official Information Act, either giving certain people the information early, for example, Cameron Slater made a request and got the answer within 24 hours. People in Canterbury who have made requests about their earthquake claims have been told, not quietly, but publicly online, that they have to wait 6 months for their request to be granted by EQC, despite the specific provisions that are altered in Part 23 of the Official Information Act, giving a rigorous timeline. So that sort of manipulation of the Official Information Act is not acceptable to this House. It's certainly not acceptable to the public, and I hope that the alterations we're making in the Statutes Amendment Bill, despite not altering any of the fundamental policy of the Official Information Act, give a bit more rigour, give a bit more clarity, and I suppose in the end, stop ministers, including the Prime Minister, manipulating what has been a very important part of our transparency as a Parliament. Ministers are held to account in this House, at Select Committee, and through requests like the Official Information Act. We must make sure that the principles of that Act are maintained, and I hope that these alterations do that. Mr. Chairman, there's just one other provision that I want to allude to, and that's the Antarctica Environmental Protection Act of 1994. Again, it's really interesting that we've got measures within this legislation to better protect Antarctica. But as we saw in the recent episode in West Auckland, ministers who were able to use provisions of protection wouldn't even do that with 2 threatened kauri trees. So we have quite, again, ironical situations where ministers who have a legal opportunity to act in the best interests of our citizens, or in this case, in protection of kauri trees, step back, but at the same time are prepared to offer better environmental protection in Antarctica. I can't think of a better cause, actually. It's one that probably most members of this House, Mr Chairman.
I call Sarah Dowie.
Thank